listen, as we conclude, I'd like to say a few words of thanks. First and foremost to all of our participants who have prepared and come here to meet with us. I think if I were an opera impresario, which I would really like to be, I would be really happy with the show that you have put on. We've had the prime donne assolute, we've had the tenori, I wonder who wants to be the basso buffo. Anyway, many thanks to all of you. I'd also like to thank Melusine Bouillat from our staff, because she has taken care of really all of the logistical work. And then Martina and Gaetan have done the photography, and then Nicolo and Gus have done the microphone. So many thanks to all of you. This conference we've done in cooperation with the Institute for the Danube Region in Central Europe, and we've also done it in cooperation with the Institute for Human Sciences. And I think one of the things about the Institute for Human Sciences is that it brings to Vienna every year some of the most remarkable intellectuals around. And we very much enjoyed cooperating with them. And I'm very happy to say that we're going to cooperate with one of them in particular now. And that is Holly Case. She is a fellow at the IWM this year. She's an associate professor at Brown University, and she's author of this wonderful new book, which is called The Age of Questions. And we thought that she's been watching and following us today. We thought that we would give her the last word. So Holly, thank you again. We look forward to hearing your last word. And after that, we're all invited next door for a small reception. Thank you.
So thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. A couple of days ago, I just happened to be at the palace at Versailles. I can say that this conference was much more fun than that. If World War I was the war, supposed to be the war to end all wars, that was definitely the tour to end all tours. It was horrific. But in any case, I've been very excited by listening to the discussion today, and I feel a bit of an imposter, not least of all because I've talked about World War I, but my two books, one of them is about World War II, and the book I just wrote is largely about the 19th century. I did trip over World War I between the two, and I take it as an item of faith that it happened. Really, one of the things that I learned from writing the book that I did is how significant World War I is indeed to the history of not just Europe, but indeed the world. So I'd like to touch upon something that was discussed at the very beginning when Ambassador Brix and Tom were making their comments about the contemporary relevance of this moment. So there have been a lot of ways in which the contemporary significance of 1919 has recurred in the discussions. So most recently, perhaps in the mention of the culture of unanimity in parallel with the European Union, or about accountability to the masses, which came up just a minute ago, and the role of the mass media in filtering that accountability. Also, the return of a kind of Wilsonian moment after 1989, as Larry has been talking about, and as Patricia discussed, this notion that there is finite space in our moment, as there's, or this conception that space is finite as being parallel to the 1919 period. And it got me thinking as a historian, when we see contemporary relevance, what is it exactly that we're seeing? Are we seeing lingering structures and institutions that carry over across the period? Is it that we're seeing patterns of historical development that recur independent of institutions? Are we seeing lingering ways of thinking? And one example might be what Eric Weitz has called population politics, that is born not necessarily out of this period, but is the dominant framework that comes out of the post-World War I, as opposed to the post-Vienna Congress way of thinking, in his view? Or is it the return of particular material and social conditions such that there's a parallel in conditions that gives rise to very similar events? And what do we see as causal in this relationship? As historians, we're supposed to be able to identify causes, what caused this moment to look like 1919. And it's very difficult, as many of you know, to trace causes 100 years back. So how would we think about causality in terms of contemporary relevance? There's another matter. Recently, a permanent fellow at the IWM, Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes wrote a book about imitation. And one thing about imitation, they use it to describe how the new so-called illiberals have used a form of imitation to propagate their political program. The interesting thing about imitation is that it short-circuits causality, because you don't need, there are no necessary, let's say, material conditions that have to adhere in a particular context. If you're looking for the particular contextual reasons why it happens here and there, in the case of imitation, you won't find them, or you won't necessarily find them. And so imitation really short-circuits causality and produces some problems for the historian. And then the historian also has a favorite, I would say one of our favorite things is to talk about contingency. And by that we mean that things might have turned out differently, and we contemplate what were the options in a given time period that weren't followed. If we consider something like contemporary relevance from 1919 to 2019, what happens to contingency? Because the contingency implies that in any given moment, we have a range of options that are inherent to that moment. And what about this moment? If we think that we're reliving something 100 years ago, are we locked into some kind of algorithm then that takes away the notion of contingency? So that raises the other question, which is what happens when people think that they're reliving a particular moment in history? And this has happened before, specifically with the Bolsheviks, who were always keeping a lookout on the horizon for the Thermidorian in their midst who was going to undermine the revolution, because they were operating according to a French revolutionary. They saw themselves as, in some respects, trying to correct for the mistakes of the French Revolution. And so what happens to the historical trajectory when historical actors think they are reliving a particular moment? And I think it's undeniable that that too starts to interfere with what happens in the now and also in the future. So I was talking to Larry Wolff in the break, and he told me something which I think is the most profound insight of this conference. He said, "History is tough." He's allowing me to quote him on that. And I think that's both very insightful and an incredible understatement, especially when we're thinking about matters of causality, which is supposedly our bread and butter. So I'd like to consider a couple of the issues in connection with contemporary relevance that were raised here today, and I'm taking two issues around the theme of zero. So the first goes to Patricia Clavin's interesting claim, which I think, which I have a lot of sympathy for, which is there was a sense in 1919 that there was limited space and that there wasn't enough, that there was a sort of, I would call this a zero-sum game dynamic that developed, whereby no one can benefit without someone else losing. And so here's the incidence of zero in terms of zero-sum thinking. So what is it that brings about zero-sum thinking? And one could think of material conditions. In some respects, you wouldn't expect zero-sum thinking from the post-World War I environment, because a lot of places are piles of rubble. So in many respects, or are seriously damaged. In many respects, there is only one way to go from the absolute bottom, and that is up. And so it's conceivable, at least, that people would not necessarily have zero-sum thinking. But remember, this was, in some respects, the first time that everyone was starting from, or that a lot of places were starting from rubble, whereas the Second World War was the second time. And I think being the first time makes one think of previous instances and wonder, instead of wondering, okay, where do I go from here, rather to wonder, how the hell did I get here? And whereas the post-World War II moment seems to be much more about thinking in terms of the only possibility being to go upwards, but clearly in many cases there was a downwards that many had construed as, and one of the things that was discussed is how nobody really felt like they won the First World War. I have a Czech friend who, when asked the general question, how do you imagine a better future, he said something I think very smart, because we were talking about how it's very difficult to imagine a better future in our contemporary moment. He said, you have to imagine yourself into a post-apocalyptic scenario. So you have to get yourself to the point where the worst is already behind you, rather than thinking that the worst is yet to come. And I'm wondering, for those of you who are on this panel, how many people were not only hopeful that they were creating a new order, but also fearful that perhaps that wasn't the worst thing that could happen, and that the new order was created with a kind of nervousness about the possibility of its recurrence, or that something even worse might transpire. Also, I'm intrigued by the fact that there wasn't much in connection with technology that was mentioned here, although in terms of zero-sum, one of the jumps that I consider interesting is the jump from the interwar notion of the Hungerplan. We were discussing famine in the course of the day, and that famine was the new technique of warfare, and the Germans actually had a plan for using famine as a form of warfare. And there's something behind famine, and that is a zero-sum conception. Like, there's either enough food for us, or there's enough food for them, but there's definitely not enough food for everyone. And one thing that the post-war order did was it brought about the agricultural revolution, where the capacity to produce food on a large scale increased dramatically. And it's an interesting question from the standpoint of the contemporary moment. If we think of technology as producing a lot of the horrors that existed in the 20th century, and we're very aware of them, and also some of them of today, do we also think, in terms of techno-utopianism, the possibility of going back or going forward to a different non-zero-sum thinking, where what hitherto seemed impossible becomes possible? And I think part of the reason why that's very difficult to imagine is a combination between one of the primary issues we have at the time, which is global warming, and the violence of the 20th century. A number of individuals independently have arrived at the conclusion that the planet would be better off without human beings. And I think you need sort of two factors to reach this conclusion. One, you have to lose faith in human beings. The 20th century does a lot for this. And two, you have to have something like an ecological crisis, where you see the impact that human beings have on the planet. And so, arguably, a lot of the events of the 20th century that come out of this period are ones that sort of dovetail with the anxiousness about our present moment as being what I would call a sub-zero moment, one in which we cannot imagine a better future. We can only imagine one that is less catastrophic than the one that's supposed to happen. We can imagine one where we gain 2 degrees rather than 4, but we can't imagine one that's objectively better. So once again, I see some of this as indeed, what happens when people think a certain way about the contemporary moment, and what happens when they connect that thinking to a particular historical experience. I'd like to talk a bit about unanimity rule that was discussed in connection with the League of Nations. One of the things with unanimity rule, I kept thinking about the liberum veto in Poland, and one of the things that does is that the remaining right of the participant is the right to spoil. And I wonder if there's a connection between the politics of spoilage, or maybe Sean would use the term subversion, and the idea of unanimity rule. Like what kind of system facilitates negotiation, compromise, coalition building of a sort that can shift, that can change, that can move? I'm not sure, but I'm intrigued by what's going on right now in East Central Europe in particular, that there is a possibility to usurp the European idea, but there is also simply a possibility to spoil it at a minimum. And so what are the structures that would create some kind of meaningful open alternatives, as Madeline might call them? So now the other zero I'd like to address is Larry's question, or when he was talking about 1919 as year zero, as a kind of tabula rasa. So when historically has there been a sense of being able to remake the international and social order? And what made it possible to think that? Once again, I think it's helpful in some respects to be confronted with a pile of rubble, with an actual tabula rasa. And one of the thought exercises I would like us to do is to transpose this conversation out of 2019 and put it in 1919. What would we be talking about as the moment that most informed 1919? And what's the most meaningful precedent for this 1919 historical moment? And in some respects, if it's indeed a year zero, maybe nothing for the drafters of the Covenant of the League of Nations. Because if there's a year zero, then you say, we are doing something absolutely new. We don't refer to the past. We don't lean on the past. We are future oriented. This is really a question as to whether they saw themselves in these terms. And then that raises a sort of parallel question, is what makes us so obsessed with commemorations? Like we were talking in the break about how those of us who run around doing commemoration talks are super busy these days because there are so many. I mean, this week it's 1919, last year it was 1918, and before that was 1917, and then it's 1989, and you have to do 1919 and 1989 together, and what happens when they interfere with each other, as Larry was pointing out, you know, like what makes these, why are we so backward reflective in our current historical moment, and what does that do to our sense of the future? And how does it inform the way we think about our contemporary moment? I think, I don't want to go on at too much length here, but I do want to say one more thing about contemporary resonance. And that is, why does it matter what a bunch of historians say at a diplomatic academy? And one of the things that came up in the discussion today is that history tends to remember and obsess about the catastrophe that did happen much more than it does about the ones that didn't happen. And this is complicated doings for historians. Historians can't really talk meaningfully about what didn't happen because our profession is about what did happen. But when you don't talk about what didn't happen, you miss a whole lot, especially when it was discussed today that tens of thousands of lives were saved by basically feeding people and distributing medicine. How do you talk about what didn't happen, namely that these people didn't die as a result of that particular event? And this strikes me as a problem that is a kind of EU problem now. How do you talk about the many nasty things that don't happen because the EU exists? This is sort of the EU PR problem, I would say, that many people don't see what the EU is and what it does because its activities are largely invisible, whereas its faults are on prominent display. That's just a thought. I'm thinking about the French 19th century historian Jules Michelet, because he wrote that with the world began a war which will end only with the world, the war of man against nature, of spirit against matter, of liberty against fatality. History is nothing other than the record of this interminable struggle. And if we define history in these terms as a kind of war what is being left out. And I'm not thinking of this in moral terms. I'm thinking of it as a historian, because I think it matters where we see power active in the world. Whether or not you think 10,000 people surviving or not is a moral good or a moral bad, it's an expression of real power in the world. And so as a potential diplomat or statesperson, it's something to be taken very seriously. So as Larry pointed out, we're not far off of direct implication in the events of 1919, those of us engaged in area studies. And our capacity for interpretation is also a kind of power, and our capacity for framing the events of our time is also a kind of power. And so one of the things I'd like to ask you to assess is the significance of the power that was exercised in the following two scenarios that were mentioned today. Namely, on the one hand, the efforts to feed the people of East Central and Southeastern Europe after World War I versus the wars that made modern Turkey. And once again, I think we could ask this question from a moral standpoint. That is not the standpoint that interests me here. The standpoint that interests me is that of power. Basically, what constitutes something that constitutes a force that moves and alters and shapes history. And I think undeniably it's a hard call to make which of those events is more important from the historical standpoint as a result. If we've indeed entered a moment which many have called a period of post-humanism, I'm also curious which of these two contributions to the historical narrative contributed more to that moment as well. And with that, I'd like to close and once again thank all the participants and to you for staying till the 11th hour. And I don't know if if I should open up to questions or move to the reception. Amen. Good. Thank you.